Rachel Johnson was 23 years old and had a 3-year-old daughter at home when she was raped, stabbed, beaten, and set on fire in Akron, Ohio on March 30th, 1991. Her body was found on Weller Avenue that same morning. The man who killed her was never identified. The case went cold. And then something happened that nobody in Rachel's family could have predicted. The man who murdered her moved across the street. He became part of her daughter's life. He gave Caitlin her first motorcycle ride. He came around the house. He watched that little girl grow up for years, the daughter of the woman he had killed. And nobody knew. Not Caitlin. Not the family. Not the Akron Police Department, who had his DNA from the crime scene and spent 29 years testing it against dozens of suspects without ever finding a match. In March 2020, Daniel Lee Reese was arrested for Rachel Johnson's murder. Genetic genealogy had connected crime scene DNA to distant relatives of Reese on a public genealogy website and worked backward through a family tree to his name. When Caitlin Puzakulix found out, she said exactly what anyone would say. It's literally insane that this dude lived across the street and had the nerve to be a part of our lives. At his sentencing, Daniel Reese stood in a Summit County courtroom and said 3 words that no amount of legal language could have said more plainly. I am a monster. He was sentenced to life in prison. To understand what happened to Rachel Johnson, you have to understand what Akron, Ohio, looked like in the early months of 1991, and what Rachel's life looked like inside it. Akron sits in Summit County in northeastern Ohio, about 40 miles south of Cleveland. In 1991, it was a city still carrying the weight of deindustrialization. The rubber industry that had made Akron famous had collapsed over the previous 2 decades as manufacturing moved overseas, and the big plants closed one by one. The city was quieter than it used to be. Neighborhoods that had been working class and stable were under economic pressure. Rachel Marie Johnson had grown up in the area and was living in Tallmadge, a suburb just east of Akron, in the spring of 1991. She was 23 years old. She was a single mother. Her daughter Caitlin had just turned 3. Rachel's life, by the account of everyone who knew her, revolved around that little girl. On the evening of March 29th, 1991, Rachel was out with a friend in Akron. They were in a vehicle together when the car got a flat tire, and they pulled into the parking lot of a convenience store at the corner of Dan Street and Glenwood Avenue in the Chapel Hill neighborhood of Akron. A small, faded, gray vehicle pulled into the lot behind them. Rachel either got into that vehicle voluntarily or was forced inside by the driver. What they knew was that she got in and the gray car left, and that was the last time anyone who cared about Rachel Johnson saw her alive. On the morning of March 30th, 1991, a passerby discovered Rachel Johnson's body on Weller Avenue in Akron, a mostly industrial road off of Home Avenue, the kind of place where a body could be left and not immediately found. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been stabbed multiple times. She had suffered severe blunt force trauma. And then, after all of that, the person who had done it had set her body on fire in an attempt to destroy the evidence. The fire had not completely done its work. Evidence survived. Akron police investigators processed the scene carefully. During the autopsy, the medical examiner collected biological evidence, swabs that would eventually produce a DNA profile of Rachel's killer. In 1991, DNA forensics was in its earliest stages. A profile could be developed from crime scene evidence, but the databases that would eventually allow investigators to compare unknown profiles against millions of records did not yet exist in any meaningful way. Rachel's 3-year-old daughter, Caitlin, was told her mother was gone. She was too young to understand what that meant. She was too young to understand that the answer to what happened to her mother was already sitting in a sealed evidence container at the Akron Police Department, waiting for technology that wouldn't arrive for nearly 3 more decades. While the Akron Police Department worked the Rachel Johnson case in 1991 and in the years that followed, Daniel Lee Reese was doing something that would strike everyone who heard it as one of the most disturbing details in a case full of disturbing details. He stayed in the neighborhood, not just in Akron. He moved to a house directly across the street from Rachel Johnson's family. He became a presence in Caitlin's childhood. He was around. He came by the house. He gave her her first motorcycle ride. He was the kind of neighbor who was just always there, part of the background of daily life in a way that nobody questions because there's no reason to. He lived right across the street, Caitlin said years later. He was always coming around. Detective James Pashilich of the Akron Police Department described Reese's invisibility in the investigation with a phrase that is both simple and staggering. He's a ghost in the investigation. He's never anywhere in it. Reese had known Rachel's family. He had been in the same area where Rachel was last seen, but his name appeared nowhere in the original investigation. No witness mentioned him. No tip pointed to him. He was never questioned, never a person of interest. While living across the street from the victim's family and spending time with the victim's daughter, 2 years after Rachel's murder, in 1993, Reese was arrested in Summit County on a felony assault charge. His DNA was not collected for entry into a forensic database because Ohio's mandatory DNA collection laws were not yet in effect in a form that would have captured him. The connection between Daniel Lee Reese and the biological evidence in the Akron Police Department storage did not exist in any system. The Rachel Johnson case did not go cold in the sense of being forgotten. It went cold in the sense of having exhausted every available tool and finding nothing. The Akron Police Department had the DNA profile from the autopsy evidence. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, as forensic DNA databases grew and the national CODIS system expanded, investigators ran the unknown profile. They got no match. Over the years, they tested dozens of men. None of them matched. In 2013, investigators went on the record with local news and confirmed they had the DNA evidence and had tested dozens of possible suspects, but still had no match. The answer was in an evidence box in Akron. It just needed the right technology to extract it. That technology arrived in the form of forensic genetic genealogy. The technique gained national attention in April 2018 when investigators announced the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, using this exact method. DeAngelo had evaded detection for decades because his DNA profile had never matched anything in law enforcement databases. Investigators uploaded his crime scene DNA to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database, found distant relatives, built a family tree, and identified him. The Akron Police Department turned to a Texas company called Advanced DNA, whose director of genetic genealogy, Cheryl Hester, specialized in exactly this kind of work. The unknown DNA profile from Rachel Johnson's autopsy was uploaded to public genealogy databases where millions of ordinary Americans had voluntarily submitted their own DNA to learn about their family histories. "It took a lot of man-hours for me to work on this," Hester said. "In this case, it was difficult. She found matches, not to the suspect directly, but to his distant relatives. She reverse-engineered the family tree from those partial matches, cross-referencing birth records, census data, and other public records, narrowing the field until the tree pointed at one man, Daniel Lee Reese, Akron, Ohio, living right there the whole time. On March 12, 2020, Daniel Lee Reese, 57 years old, was arrested and charged with aggravated murder for the killing of Rachel Marie Johnson 29 years earlier. Caitlin Puza-Kulitz was 31 years old when she found out. She had grown up knowing her mother had been murdered and not knowing who did it. And then she found out that the man she had childhood memories of, the man who had given her her first motorcycle ride, the man who had come around the house and been part of her growing up, was the person who had taken her mother. "It's insane," Caitlin said. "It's literally insane that this dude lived across the street and had the nerve to be a part of our lives. He took me on my very first motorcycle ride. He lived right across the street. He was always coming around." Detective Pashilich described Reese with a word that feels precisely chosen. He's like a chameleon. Nobody, including us, had any clue that he's the person. After his arrest, Daniel Reese's case moved through the Summit County court system over 3 years. For the Johnson family, that process meant 3 more years of waiting, in which the man who had killed Rachel was present in the legal system, but not yet fully accountable to it. Rachel's father, Larry Johnson, spoke in the years after the arrest about what it meant to have spent nearly 30 years without an answer. About what it meant to look at Caitlin and think about what had been taken. "When you lose your child," he said, "you have this empty hole in your heart, you know, and you think of her every day." In 2023, facing the weight of DNA evidence that was not going to be successfully challenged, Daniel Lee Reese entered a guilty plea in Summit County to aggravated murder. Prosecutors agreed to change the underlying felony from rape to kidnapping, sparing Reese a possible death sentence. In exchange, Reese pleaded guilty to the full murder charge. The plea spared the Johnson family and Caitlin from having to testify in open court. The sentencing hearing took place in Summit County in 2023 before Judge Susan Baker Ross. Rachel's sister, Layla Haynes, called Reese an abomination and a coward. Rachel's father, Larry Johnson, tried to deliver his remarks but was so overcome with grief and anger that he struggled to get through them. The weight of 32 years came out in that courtroom in a way that no prepared statement could fully contain. "It never ends," Larry Johnson said. "They say closure. What the hell is closure?" He asked the judge to give Reese what he deserved, to make him spend a lifetime in prison. Then Daniel Lee Reese spoke. "I am a monster," Reese said. "What I did is horrendous. The crime I did is horrendous." He apologized specifically for what he had done afterward, for inserting himself into the family's lives, for the motorcycle rides and the visits and all of it. He called that the worst thing to do. Judge Susan Baker Ross sentenced Daniel Lee Reese to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years, the most severe sentence available under Ohio law at the time of the crime, short of the death penalty. Reese was 60 years old at sentencing. After everything, the arrest, the proceedings, the plea, the sentencing, The person whose words carry the most weight is the one who was 3 years old when Rachel Johnson was murdered, and who spent her childhood with her mother's killer, living across the street. Caitlin Puzakulich grew up knowing she had lost her mother to violence. She also grew up with memories of Daniel Reese, the motorcycle ride, the visits, the man across the street who was part of the background of her childhood. When those memories were retroactively connected to who Reese actually was, what Caitlin experienced was not just the grief of learning the truth about her mother's murder. It was the additional specific horror of understanding that the killer had been present in her life, that she had memories of him, memories which had been neutral or even positive, now something else entirely. "He took me on my very first motorcycle ride," she said. "He lived right across the street. He was always coming around." Caitlin was 31 when the arrest was announced. She will spend the rest of her life knowing the answer to the question that shaped her entire childhood, knowing who did it, knowing he is in prison. That is not the same as having her mother back, but it is something. It is the thing that took 32 years to arrive, and finally did. The Rachel Johnson case is one of hundreds of cold cases solved since the Golden State Killer arrest in 2018 demonstrated that forensic genetic genealogy could crack cases that had defeated every other method. Traditional forensic DNA databases, primarily CODIS, work by comparing an unknown crime scene DNA profile to profiles entered into the system by convicted offenders. If the perpetrator has never been convicted of a qualifying offense, their profile simply doesn't appear. The crime scene DNA matches nothing. Genetic genealogy bypasses that limitation entirely. Instead of searching law enforcement databases, it searches public databases where ordinary people have voluntarily submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry. These databases contain tens of millions of profiles and grow constantly. When an unknown crime scene DNA profile is uploaded, investigators look for partial matches, people who share enough genetic material to suggest a family connection. A third cousin, a second cousin twice removed. From those partial matches, forensic genealogists build family trees using birth certificates, census data, death records, and other public records to map the extended family and narrow the field to candidates who match the age, sex, and geography of the crime. It is slow, labor-intensive work, but it works on cases that have been sitting cold for decades because the genealogy databases don't contain criminals. They contain ordinary people who wanted to know about their ancestry. And some of those ordinary people happen to be related to someone who committed a crime and left their DNA at the scene. In the Rachel Johnson case, distant relatives of Daniel Reese had submitted their DNA to genealogy websites with no connection to any criminal investigation. Their voluntary submission created the thread that Cheryl Hester followed from a partial match all the way back to the name of the man living across the street from his victim's family. Lesson 1. The psychology of proximity. Daniel Reese did not flee. He moved across the street and embedded himself in the grieving family's life for years. This behavior, killer proximity, has appeared in other cold cases. Every time Reese asked whether there was news about the investigation, he was making a sustained, ongoing choice across 29 years. That is not guilt. That is a person who decided to keep going. Lesson 2. The DNA collection gap. Reese was arrested in 1993 on a felony assault charge. Had Ohio's mandatory DNA collection laws been fully in effect, his DNA would have entered CODIS, and the connection to the 1991 crime scene would have been made years earlier. Rachel Johnson's case is one of the costs of that policy gap. The technology to solve it existed earlier. A law could have triggered it. Lesson 3. Evidence that survived a fire. Rachel's killer tried to burn her body to destroy the evidence. The fire failed completely enough that biological material survived and was collected during the autopsy and preserved for 29 years. The medical examiner and investigators who processed the scene in 1991 could not have known what technology would be available decades later. They preserved the evidence anyway. That choice is the reason this case was solvable. Rachel Marie Johnson was 23 years old. She was a single mother. Her daughter Caitlin was 3. On the night of March 29th, 1991, she got into a gray car in a convenience store parking lot in Akron and did not come home. For 29 years, Caitlin grew up with a question underneath everything. For part of those years, she grew up with her mother's killer living across the street, giving her motorcycle rides, coming around the house, being part of her childhood. Daniel Lee Reese is in a Summit County Correctional Facility serving a life sentence. He stood in a courtroom and called himself a monster. He apologized specifically for befriending the family afterward. Caitlin Puzakulitz knows who killed her mother. She knows he is in prison. She knows the question that shaped her entire life finally has an answer. It's literally insane, she said, that this dude lived across the street and had the nerve to be a part of our lives. He did, and now he's gone.